Everyone.
Afternoon.
Welcome and thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the unexpected weather. We are elated to have you here to all be together for the first time live in 3 years, especially on this special occasion with our honored guest. It's wonderful to see so many new and familiar faces.
The microphone is not working.
Oh.
Hey, test. Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
There we go.
Okay, I'm going to start over. Good afternoon and welcome.
Afternoon.
It's great to see everyone. Thank you for braving the weather, and it's wonderful to be here with everybody live for the first time in 3 years, especially on this occasion with our special guest, our honored guest.
Yes.
So I wanted to say, my name is Dana Harris Travato, and I am the board chair. Thank you. I'm the board chair for the CityLit project. And as the chair, I have the pleasure of working closely with our executive director, Carla Dupre. And as many of you know, she is an absolute powerhouse for all things literary. She's a fierce and passionate advocate for the arts. She not only promotes books and authors and poets, but she loves to get people together, to grapple about important issues, and to celebrate the uniqueness of every voice, particularly those that otherwise would not be known. Because of Carla, during these past few years of the difficult pandemic, we have done more programming than we have ever done in the history of our 19 years. And this month alone, for this festival, we are offering throughout the month 10 sessions where over 40 authors and poets are presenting their work. We also could not do this work without your support, so for that, we are truly grateful. So without further ado, let's hear it for the Executive Director of CityLit, Carla Dupre.
Thank you, Dana. Welcome. Welcome. You have no idea what I would say today was like, but you have no idea what the last 3 years has been like for CityLit. But guess what? You're here. You are here. You are here, and we are too, to celebrate literature. I'm going to just, I didn't plan this, but I'm just going to show you the books that you need to pick up today. There are a ton of them, but for this session, you need to pick up this book. You need to. Vanguard by Martha S. Jones. You need to pick up this book. Without saying, you need to pick up this book. And you might want to pick up a couple more to give it to people who need to know it. Okay? And at least you need to pick up this book by my wintergreen sister, Renee Watson. She is a force in and of herself. You need to pick up this book. You need to pick up this magazine. Okay. Okay, so this is Be More Art. They're a media sponsor. They've been around for a bit, but you need to know more about them. You need to subscribe. It's a gorgeous magazine. This particular issue has a article on me and CityLit. And guess what? It's called More is More, because CityLit believes more is more is more is never enough. Okay? And before I really tell you what this is about, this program is about, please, we have a master class coming up, $10. You don't get it cheaper than this. You need to tell your friends, anybody that wants to write those little stories we don't really want to talk about, things that happen at home that you feel a little twisted about, you need to write about them. You need to write about them. Okay, look it up. Lastly, Insight 180, our small graphic design company that adopted CityLit Project as their nonprofit. They make us walk around with their hair looking pretty, and we are so thankful. This program, yes, it is hefty. Yes, it is wordy, but it lets you know about our hard work all these years. It lets you know what we've been going through because we talk about solitude and being alone. We talk about becoming American. We talk about things that happen in our lives. We talk about writing on the page and how difficult it is to tell our stories, and we want you to get it right. And we want you to support a small graphic design company that really loves a little CityLit project, literary nonprofit. They take care of us. We want you to take care of us by reading it, supporting us, filling out our little evaluation. And we got really hip. We put a QR code here. Now, I'll be honest, I can't tell you how it works other than you scan it with your you scan it with your phone and get an evaluation because we need to hear from you. And what you don't know is we read every evaluation. The ones that tear us apart and say, oh, we're not doing enough. So I kind of look at those sketchy like. But the ones that tell us what you want. You wanted a graphic artist, we got you a graphic artist. Graphic author. But now let's talk about this. And I have to do it from my notes because I get so intense and excited that I have to refer to them. Start from the beginning. Good afternoon, good people. Welcome to our 19th CityLit Festival. Do you hear me? And might I say our 19th free CityLit Festival, because what we have come to learn that is unheard of, the caliber of authors, poets, and writers we bring to this stage, you pay money for it across the country. You don't pay money here. You know why? We want access. That is a huge thing with us. We don't want there to be any reason. I don't even care about the weather. We don't want to be any reason that you couldn't get to us. I'm going to stick with my script. This year, it's month-long, this festival. It's virtual, and at different locations, it's live with 3 in-person events. This is our first live event since November 2019. Holla if you hear me. And I'm not gonna lie, it is good to see your faces. I mean, it is really, really good to see your faces. You look good, Baltimore. Can you turn to the next person, the person beside you, and say, you look good? You look good, right?
You look good.
Now, real talk, we know you can't see their faces, but you can see their eyes, right? And the eyes are smiling, aren't they? They're smiling. How about that? After a long, hard day, you see your smiling eyes atop a mask. I'm good with that. You look good, folks. But how are you feeling? Right? How you feeling? Who knew then when we were at the Inner Harbor at the CityLit stage in 2019, listening to poets Dominique Christina and Kadwadi Fidel on a late Friday night, spitting poetry, making us relive Emmett Till. Our hearts surged like fists in our chests, making us remember like good poems do. We had no idea. Can I get some water, please? We had no idea what we were about to go through, did we? I got all excited. Excuse me. You know, back in the days when you were a model, they told you to put Vaseline in your teeth so when you smiled, it would slip.
It still works.
It still works? Okay, so I didn't get my Vaseline.
Just saying.
Okay, let me get back. We had no idea what we were about to go through, did we? And here we are almost 3 years to the day later, and we're breathing in hope and possibility as a storm brews in our midst. My name is Carla Dupre, the executive director of CityLit Project. We are a small but fierce literary nonprofit in Baltimore, Maryland. Many of you may not know our name, may have never attended our events, but you're here now and we welcome you. We've been elevating literature and supporting writers since 2004. We have brought some of the very best writers to this city, and today is no different. This festival season, we aim to bring you more. Before I share a few things about this festival, I want to tell you, sometimes big things happen when a small band of people gather with intention and make it happen. CityLit is a staff of 1, yours truly, and a board of 6 committed people. You got that?
That's amazing.
And I'm so proud of this organization. I have to call out the names of our board members. Dana, and if you could stand. Dana Harris Travado, our board chair, who you met earlier. Brian Lyles, our immediate past chair. Chelsea Lemon Fetzer, our vice chair. Bunky Markhurd, our treasurer. Tracy Diamond, our newest member. Aditya Desai, who's our secretary, out celebrating his birthday. And also new to our team is Joe Massa, our CityLit gladiator who has had a baptism by festival fire. And I just met him today. Our leadership council includes Kate Markert, founder emeritus, Greg Wilhelm, who couldn't join us tonight, Judy Cooper, Chick Dumbach, who is always with us in spirit, and E. Scott Johnson. Those are the people who guide me through this experience. 95% of our events are free. If we charge anything, it's $10, since some funders believe we have to make money some kind of way to stay whole. We believe in lifting up writers at every stage in their journey. More than anything, we believe in access. That in order to grow a community that cares, a village that serves, and a country that embraces and teaches our young, invites our champions our way of being, we have to figure out ways to open up doors and confront the truth. A fierce champion of youth, Jean Lewis, once told me, some people see a closed door and turn away. Still others see a closed door, try the knob. If the knob doesn't open, they find a key. If the key doesn't fit, they turn away. A rare few see a closed door, try the knob. If it doesn't open, they find a key. If the key doesn't fit, they make one. CityLit is about the key. We make them. It means opening books, placing a pen in a young man's hands, teaching a woman how to craft a story she can't share with her family, or to shed some light on the way we be. We will continue making keys. It's a learned community that builds humanity and bridges hope. We introduce our audience to all kinds of literary flavor, but we will talk about the things nobody wants to openly discuss. You know, things like race, like prison and mental illness, like colorism, and all the things that bring us shame. The funny thing about shame, once it's out in the open and everybody knows about it, you have the opportunity to fix things. CityLit is known for peeling back the covers and looking at the hard stuff, so to give you the tools to fix it. We're living in times where the not knowing is as burdensome as the running from. We believe we stand a better chance of righting wrongs and healing wounds when we drag that scrungy old elephant out to the middle of the room and face her, sit with her for a minute, and be still with the harm we've done. Which brings me to my next point. The theme of our festival is how we break free, confronting hard truths. Some wondered if we should keep it light. It's spring, you know. People need hope. Why did it have to be a chain? You see that little, you know, that chain got a little messy when people saw it. Like, who wants to see a chain and a broken one at that? I can't find my flyer, but you should have a program, right? A chain was way too much, too linked to bad times. Well, my first thought was, we didn't want to use a rope. Torn and frayed at both ends, did we? For some of us, that held a horrific bit of history. For some of us, it meant too many things for too many reasons. We chose chains because these last 3 years broke our spirits, forced us on our knees. My husband, Al, used to say, it's one thing to pray on your knees, quite another to pray on your face. When your need is so great, your burden so heavy, your knees can't hold the weight. We chose how we break free from the things that harm us, from the things that force us back, because we wanted people to talk about the weight they're carrying and how to find release. With this festival, we explored the hardship of loneliness, what it means when we face isolation, right alongside the gift of solitude, where you can be in a room filled with loved ones and still feel the ache of being alone. You feel me? We dealt with writing and what it takes to be truthful on the page, why we need access to the truth. So you're not like me, scouring the bottom shelf of a public library on your knees when you're 11 years old before you see yourself in a poem. Or like our keynote speaker who was 15 years old when she came across the relevance of the year 1619 and how it planted its root and a curiosity that brought her here today. Nikole Hannah-Jones could easily address that. And there's more breaking free left to come. How we get free and the birth of promise when we do. Our program's designed by our partners inside 180. Yes, it's hefty, but read it and it will take you places. You'll see what we've been through, what it's like to flee a war-torn country with nothing but the clothes on your back and holding a child's hand. Coming to a country to learn a tongue that feels strange in your mouth, where you hope you and your child will be safe, becoming American. One of today's sessions was crafting nonfiction. We build writers and make the crafting of words accessible so we can grow journalists and historians, Black ones and Asian ones, Latinos ones, and ones who belong to tribal nations. We're about the key. When the New York Times published the first article on the 1619 Project, we knew then and there it wasn't business as usual. Who was this Nikole Hannah-Jones who had a warrior written all over her with that flame of kinky hair, whoever she was? I had to say it, right? Sisters and sister, whoever she was, she lit a match and got our attention. I don't know about you, but I wanted a copy of it. So did thousands of others who stood in lines to buy it. When we put out the word, we wanted to bring in the creator of this groundbreaking work, but we needed the help of others. Many joined in. We are thankful to our partners who are represented today. Please stand or wave as I acknowledge you. Maryland Centers for Creative Classrooms, thank you. Maryland Humanities, thank you. Arts Education in Maryland Schools, thank you. Motor House, thank you. Greater Baltimore Cultural Alliance, thank you. Busboys and Poets Baltimore, thank you. Be More Art, our media sponsor, thank you. The Ivy Bookshop, who is selling books today on the second floor, thank you. Joyful Signing, our ASO interpreters for our virtual events, thank you. Sister with the Bike Travel, thank you, because she helped me out this morning. We can't thank you enough, but today it's about the 1619 Project, isn't it? Let me introduce Martha S. Jones, who is a historian, a prize-winning author, and a treasure to Baltimore, a commentator, and the Society, yes, give her a props, and the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor at Johns Hopkins University. Her work focuses on how Black Americans have shaped the history of American democracy. Her most recent book is Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, a history of African American women's politics. In 2018, she published a new history of the early African American struggle for citizenship, Birthright Citizens, her book. She was recently named one of the 25 Black Marylanders to watch by the Baltimore Sun. And guess what? We agree. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Martha S. Jones in conversation with our guest female speaker.
Well, Nikole Hannah-Jones, am I on? Beware, the Baltimore Sun is watching. That's what I want to say. And welcome to Baltimore City, back to Baltimore City.
Yes.
Welcome to the Pratt Library. It's really a joy on this crazy winter day to be with you. So thanks so much for coming out.
Of course, always a joy to see you. And we haven't seen each other much in person, but a lot on Zoom. Hello, Baltimore. I love coming to the city, and I appreciate everyone who, braved this half a little tiny bit of snow. I know y'all were real proud of yourselves that you came out in this weather, but as a Midwesterner, just please. My flight was canceled this morning because of weather. We had to find alternative transportation, the train, which I don't generally take, but it was civilized. It was great. But I was going to drive if I had to, because when I commit, and I know how hard Ms. Carla worked on this, when I commit to something, I will do everything in my power to come. So I'm just excited for the conversation, and I do appreciate everyone who came out and everyone who is also watching online.
So I'm supposed to introduce you, but apparently you need no introduction, as they say. But I do want to go back to my notes because I knew that it would embarrass you if I read the long version. But I want to tell you what I picked out.
Okay. I don't feel like
no.
we have
Well,
to do that.
I want you to hear this because I worked on this.
Okay.
And I want to come back to a bit of it. So, daughter of Waterloo, Iowa.
Oh. Okay. That doesn't happen a lot.
Inheritor of the Great Migration.
Yes.
Student of history, investigative reporter, bearer of Ida B. Wells's legacy. Now, people, I can't do the awards, and so you feel free to visit Nikole Hannah-Jones's website, where they are myriad, but I'll mention a couple. Most recently, 2 NAACP Image Awards, Pulitzer Prize. And I believe I'm right. We're in week 16 on the New York Times bestseller list. Am I?
We are.
Am
yes.
I keeping track? I'm keeping
Yes.
track. I'm keeping track.
Yes.
And of course, what brings you here to Baltimore City this afternoon? Creator of the 1619 Project. Thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you.
So I want to ask you about Waterloo, Iowa,
Okay.
because I'm one of those folks, I think, for a long time in my life, guilty of branding a whole swath of America flyover country.
You'd be right, but it's okay.
But tell me, where is Waterloo in this book? And because we might not recognize it.
Absolutely. So I love that bio because, awards are things that in our profession we're supposed to get so that people can believe we actually, have value. But awards are not defining of anything other than how someone else sees your work. So Waterloo, though, it's on my wrist. I talk about my hometown all of the time because it is defining of who I am. I say all the time, I'm from, working class family in a no-name town in a flyover state, a place where whenever people meet me, I'm usually the first and only Black Iowan they've ever met. And I say all the time, yes, most of us are related, but we are there, right? And there are tons of towns like this all across the Midwest and the Rust Belt that we don't ever think about, but that Black folks came from the South carrying their dreams, hoping to find this promised land that, of course, does not exist for us in America. And my family was part of that great migration. Now, we were part of the agrarian migration from sharecropping in Mississippi. And I always say we were so country that we saw Waterloo and thought we had hit the big city and didn't make it all the way to Chicago, which is where most of our folks ended up in Chicago. But, alas. So I grew up in this small, very blue collar town. Black folks came there for manufacturing jobs, beef packing plants. There was a huge meat packing plant called Wrath that many folks worked at, and to work at John Deere if you were lucky. And originally came as strikebreakers on the railroad, though they were recruited not knowing they were strikebreakers. They were recruited being told that there were these great paying jobs building the railroad, and then they get there in the midst of a racial tempest, right? So they are brought up and then they are seen as the enemy immediately because they are crossing the picket line, but they find themselves in Waterloo, and what are they going to do now? So this was kind of the history of our folks of being seen as a problem from the moment we arrived, and there weren't enough Black folks there, but there were definitely enough to segregate us. And I grew up in a red line neighborhood, started my life in mostly Black, but somewhat integrated schools, and then bused to white schools from the 2nd grade to the 12th grade as part of a desegregation program. And I really do believe that my curiosity about racist systems began on that 2-hour bus ride that I took every day out of my neighborhood into a white neighborhood that wasn't mine, into a white school that wasn't mine. And I could see the landscape of inequality through the school bus window. You could literally see how, as we left the Black side of town, all of a sudden the road started getting, paved and taken care of, that there were restaurants and shopping places on the other side of town. The houses were bigger. They were more well cared for. And yet I didn't know anybody who worked harder than the people in my community, right? Like, they were working jobs where when they got home, I picture this in my head all the time when my dad and then my uncles, when they would get home after working in a meat plant all day, they couldn't even make a fist. Their hands were so swollen, and they would just be filthy. And my dad would have blood all over his clothes, and he would shower, and then he would go to a second job. And yet we're told that the reason Black people were struggling was because we just didn't want to work for the things that everybody and all of humanity wants. Somehow we didn't like, we're the only people in the history of the world who somehow liked bad schools, crime-ridden neighborhoods, and broken down housing, right? Like that's what they would tell us. So it was that experience of going into these white neighborhoods and white schools and seeing that those parents worked hard too, but they didn't work harder, certainly, than the people in my community, that really led me to want to question why was our society like this? And it was history that started to explain that architecture. That was a long answer, but that's how I am.
No, is exactly where I wanted us to go, because I think one of the things you do in this book is open the door to precisely that kind of thinking, right? About how we get to, the deeply researched, the long considered understandings. They start in those very intimate scenes. And I wanted to just point folks to Nicole's opening essay, chapter 1, which is titled Democracy. And I want to ask you about democracy. But I want to mention to folks that the first image in this book is your father.
Yes.
And here he is. It's the 1960s. I'm reading the label, Germany. He's in his, I assume, army uniform,
Yes.
in front of a Jeep. And you do something for us because you remind all of us that our families, our histories, our stories are part of this American story and part of this story and this problem, perhaps, I think, of democracy. And I do have a question because I think that, in some ways, this photograph to me reminded me of your essay, of your father, of his flag. My own dad was a Navy veteran, Black Navy veteran from World War II, right? And a man who never lost his heart for that experience and that part of his Americanness. But when you were thinking about this essay and you wanted to call it democracy, I came back to it this week and I thought, so were you troubled? Were you prescient? What did you realize sort of where we would be in this American democracy? Fragile, fractured, faltering, under siege, right? Choose your characterization. But we're certainly not in that ideal place or any sort of arrived at place as a democracy. And I guess I want to know what you think we should take away from the 1619 Project for confronting what is clearly going to be a new chapter in our democracy, a chapter where we don't take any of it for granted.
That was a lot in that question.
Yeah,
Martha.
well, I'm an academic, and I do believe
I was like,
Ms.
I had to take some
Hannah-Jones
notes
knows
down
that.
on
So
one 'cause that was a lot.
I'll give you my cards. Democracy. What are we like?
So much.
Thank you.
The essay's like 11,000 words, so most of that will be in there somewhere. So let me just first say, the photo, you talk about the photo of my dad. One of my favorite parts of the book are the photos, which is different from the original project. Every single essay begins with a photo. And a young Black woman who I actually found on Instagram as the one who curated these photos from us. Her name is Kimberly Anise Henderson. And the reason that we decided to do the photos was so the photos are not of anyone famous. No one in the book is famous. Most of the people in the book are not even featured in the essay. There's only 2 essays where the photo is actually of someone in the essay, one being my father. But they're just regular Black folks living their lives from the beginning of photography all the way to the present. And we did that because you shouldn't have to remind people that every story you're hearing, every atrocity, every struggle is a real human being. Like a regular person who just wanted the same thing that any human being's always wanted. And then when it comes to Black folks, we have to remind you of that and take it out of the abstract. So the photos are just, they force you to pause before you enter every essay and just think about the humanity and think about who was not acting in humanity in these stories, and it was not us, and that's really important. And I wasn't going to put my dad's photo, but of course, I one of the things my dad gave me, he didn't die with really any money. He didn't own anything that would have monetary value, but he owned things that had great value for me. And one of the things he gave me shortly before he died was he had this plastic bag full of photos from his time in Germany. And one of those photos, this particular photo, he had blown up because he really wanted me to have this photo. And I thought a lot about why this photo. And the only time my dad ever felt fully American and fully like a man was when he was not in America. And when he was wearing this uniform of a country, right? Think of every statistic you hear about Black people: overrepresented in prison, overrepresented in poverty, the favorite of the white racists, the out of wedlock numbers of Black women, all of these numbers. But we're also overrepresented in serving in the armed forces. We serve at the highest rate of any group, and we always have since we had an opportunity to serve. And yet you never hear that number, and there's a reason why, right? So the fact that this meant so much to my dad, and yet his patriotism is also what we clashed about a lot because I just couldn't understand it. In many ways, this essay, it was, when I started, I'm gonna get to your multi-part question, sorry.
We have time.
When I conceived of the project, I knew that there were two essays that had to be in the project. They had to go at the two pillars of American identity about America as an exceptional nation. So one had to be on democracy and one had to be on capitalism, period. And I was thinking about troubling this narrative of democracy through the civil rights movement and really arguing the fact that we were not a democracy until the civil rights movement. A democracy cannot exist where you have an entire region of the country where sometimes half of the population can't vote. But in some, I think the lowest percentage would have been 20% was Black. And then you go all the way to Mississippi, which at some points, half of the people were Black, and they couldn't vote. So we had an ethnocracy, which is a democracy for white people, which is not a democracy. So I was thinking about this essay, like I wanted to use the civil rights movement to show like, this is how we get democracy. And then I start researching, and this is the beauty of writing, is in seeking to like edify other people, you hope you are also edifying yourself. And I start going back in time and further back. Your text, Birthright Citizen, was one of the texts that I read. And you realize like, actually the Black people in shaping democracy goes back to the very beginning, but we're not taught about that. I mean, we're literally taught like Black folks were just not even enslaved, not enslaved, like slaves, like not engaged in what was happening, not aware of what was happening, somehow not fighting for their freedom. Like this is how racism works, is everything that's normal for human beings, we have to be taught somehow wasn't normal for us. So we accepted slavery. We didn't resist. We didn't fight. We weren't thinking about democracy. We weren't engaging. So I was at once working through the Black role in democracy and also working through my father issues, right? So I'm like, how did this man who never felt free except when he was not in America, who the best time of his life was in another country, with its own terrible racial past, right? But he can go there and feel free. What does that say about America and democracy? And how can I understand how Black people have continued to fight for this country, despite everything that this country has done to us? I remember the first time I learned about colonization, and the most illogical thing in the world to me was that Black people had an opportunity to leave and didn't. I never why would you stay here in a country that for 250 years enslaved you, and now you believe they're going to treat you right? And reading the words of Black Americans who were like, no, this is our country. We built this country. Our ancestors' blood is in the soil of this country. You don't have the right to tell us that we can't claim the only country that we've ever known. was really transformative in my own thinking and understanding of the role that Black people have played in our democracy and the credit that we should get and we haven't. And then I realized, as I say in the essay, you know, when you're young, you think you know so much, but you really know so little. And you live a little, you learn a little. And my dad was not claiming, you know, a type of flag pin wearing, performative, our country could do no wrong patriotism, but he was claiming a patriotism that says, this is our country. This is my inheritance. This is my lineage. And I will fight to make this country live up to its ideals. And you don't have the right to strip me of that lineage. And that's a powerful kind of patriotism. So this essay is really trying to work through all of that, you know, a 400-year struggle to force our country to live up to what really are majestic ideals. I mean, those words of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with inalienable rights. These are majestic and powerful words. They were just written by men who didn't believe in them. And I did this, you know, which is not even that uncommon. We all say shit we don't believe, do it all the time. And I assigned my students, one of the first things I did in my class at Howard was I asked students to say, what is the Declaration of Independence to you? Like, what is this document? And they universally think of it as a liberty document because of that open stanza. But of course, as you know, it's a succession document. Like those beautiful words at the top are like just to hook the reader in, right? Or, you know, they're trying to win over the colonial powers in their decision to break off from the empire. But most of it is just the list of grievances that they have against the British to say, this is why we deserve to break off. And it was through Woody Holton's work that I learned that it was a Black man who first turned the Declaration into a liberty document. I think his name was Lemuel Samuels or something like that, where he read that opening line and he begins to write about the Declaration as being an abolitionist document, that you can't say that at the beginning and then just keep on practicing slavery. That doesn't work. But we're not taught to think about any of these ways that we as the bottom are really seeing this expansive view of democracy. So the essay had to be the first essay in the book, and it's getting us to really question. So no, I wouldn't say I was prescient that I could predict what was happening, but of course you can just see what's happening because this is what has always happened. Democracy existed because it was a democracy predicated on exclusion of Black people, exclusion of women of all races at some points, exclusion of Indigenous people. And so our idea about a functioning democracy is really based on this idea that only white people were citizens who could decide. And it's ever since the Civil Rights Movement, which we tend to think about as people sitting at lunch counters getting mustard poured on their heads. The most violence was reserved for voting. I mean, they were killing white people about fighting with Black people for voting. And once that wins, then our political parties, like the type of division that we see now, comes from other people who aren't white being able to engage in the democratic process. So it's not, where we are is not shocking. But I also think it's important that we don't have to be shocked and can still be appalled, right? Things don't have to surprise us for us to be appalled and to be very frightened by them, because we are at a very unusual and dangerous place in our democracy, which these anti-history laws are clearly showing. I don't even know what your question was anymore. Now I'm just talking.
That's all right. That's all right.
That's your fault, though. You shouldn't have asked all those different questions. I will say just quickly, though, all of the titles, and I fought really hard for all the titles to have one word, which wasn't the inclination of my magazine editors who, you know, they're like historians. They want like long thing and a semicolon and, you know. But I was like, there's a power in that single word entry into every story, because just by going down the timeline, you see that slavery has touched everything. The legacy of slavery has touched everything. And you get that in a way with a single word that you wouldn't otherwise. And the first thing we need to understand is the very idea of democracy is built on the antithesis of democracy. The very idea that we are a democratic republic was built on the belief by Virginians who are crafting these Republican ideas that the masses of people will never engage in democracy because they're enslaved. And that means something.
You know, I'm thinking about Sherilyn Ifill, who I know is a
Warrior.
There we go, Baltimorean
Warrior.
and more. And of course, president director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Sherilyn, I think, has said, you know, American democracy begins in 1954, right, with Brown versus Board of Education. But I want to ask you if you see it that way.
I could never publicly disagree with Sherilyn.
You're correct.
Right.
But go on.
I would just move that timeline up.
Mhm.
I would say it begins in 65 with the Voting Rights Act because, but you know, I defer to Sherilyn on that. I am not going to publicly contest anything that she says.
Okay, so I want to ask you about this room, but I want to ask you about the many kinds of rooms you have been in as you have rolled out this book and brought it to so many readers. You and I were together in Washington, D.C. For the launch week, and a room not unlike this. I've been on podcasts with thousands of listeners, and even book clubs, right, with a handful of folks, right? That it's to say, folks have turned out, have not only bought the book, but have read it and are thinking about the kinds of propositions that it offers us. So to me, this is heartening about our democracy, right? That in fact, there's a hunger, there's a thirst. I know I'm going to talk too much, but bear with me. So I was remembering, and I wondered if you did, in 2005, the New York Historical Society had an exhibit. It was actually 3 exhibits over 2 years called Slavery in New York. And part of what went on behind the scenes, as I understand it, is that there was real skepticism about whether anyone would come out for an exhibit called Slavery in New York, right? Folks thought no one's going to come. Nobody understands what that is, and nobody's interested in learning about it. But it was a blockbuster, and folks came out by the droves. You had to get your ticket. You had to wait in line. It was extraordinary. And this feels like that to me, that somehow you put something right out, right, and folks have shown up. So for me, this is another way of thinking about democracy. And I wonder what you've learned sort of being out there, being with folks, big rooms, small rooms, Zooms, and more, about this other part of our democracy, which are folks who have responded to this book by not only putting it on the bestseller list, but by reading with it and engaging with this history, even as sometimes that history is tough.
I feel like you asked me a version of this question when we were in DC. Yes. Okay. Which just speaks to that. It's a great question because I get a lot of questions. I don't remember most of them. So I agree. So I think that this is hard for me to answer. Let me back up. So one, everyone who's ever heard me talk anywhere knows I am not an optimistic person. I don't engage in optimism. I don't find it useful. Part of it is probably, dysfunctional childhood. If I just keep my expectations low, I'm rarely disappointed, but I'm sometimes surprised. I'm not an optimistic person, but I do understand a few things. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years as we've seen the project being targeted by some of the most powerful people in the world. I mean, President of the United States, Secretary of State, 2 of the most powerful senators, Tom Cotton, Mitch McConnell, state legislatures, as they're banning, passing these anti-history laws. If there is a text specifically named, it is the 1619 Project. And so I've wondered, what is it? Because while I think I'm amazing, I'm not that damn powerful. Like I really don't understand it in some ways. And I realized that there were a couple things going on. We know in 2020, of course, with the murder of George Floyd, we saw the largest global protest for Black lives in the history of the world. And in America, for the first time, these were extremely multiracial, multi-generational. They were happening not just in urban areas, but in small, formerly white towns. I mean, even like Vidor, Texas, which was still fighting the government to desegregate its public housing in like the 90s. That's still something like 98% white. And they were all in the streets. And then I was looking at the polling, and the polling was showing that people were making like 1619, this 400-year struggle, this idea that the inequality that we see, the country that would allow a police officer to literally just sit on a man's body until he leashed all the life out of his body, and he knew that there were witnesses recording him, yet expected to face no consequence, that the country that produces that is a country that is dealing, right, with centuries of inequality and racism and structures. And so the polling shows that Americans were getting that they were drawing these connections, that this wasn't just about policing, this wasn't just about now, but that this was about a very long history and legacy that was still shaping our society. And the 1619 Project was part of that. It wasn't the only thing, but it was helping to shape that lexicon, as well as activism, and as well as all the scholarship that undergirds the project. So one poll showed 1 in 10 Americans participated in those protests. That's an astounding figure.
It is.
Another poll showed 7 of 10 Americans said they had had a conversation about race in their house during those protests. 7 out of 10 in a country, you know, that rabidly tries to pretend that race is over. We don't need to discuss it. And then probably the number that astounded me the most, and this is the number that had to get a response, was 45% of Republicans said that systemic inequality was a primary obstacle for Black equality. Now think about that. Almost half of Republicans who are not saying it's just about individuals, it's pathology, it's culture, Black people just, you know, we are equal society, Black people just won't take advantage of the opportunity, but they are saying, actually, there is something bigger and structural. And as you know, narrative drives policy. Narrative drives policy. If you believe that we are a fundamentally fair country, that racism was banished in 1968 when we passed the last civil rights law and everybody has the same opportunities, then you support policy for that. But if you believe we are not in a fundamentally fair society, that things that happened a long time ago actually are shaping the inequality we see today, that the government played a role in that, and so the government must act, then you support policies for that. And we saw that, right? We saw Biden push to the left in his rhetoric. He was talking about race, talking about things like, well, he never talked about defund, but certain people were talking about real policing reforms. You know, he tried to pass this reparations for farmers, Black farmers. Like there was a policy response, and 7 million more people oust the white nationalist president in the largest presidential victory margin in the history of the United States. Georgia sends its first Black senator to Congress since Reconstruction. We see people who are taking this understanding, this narrative, and they are using it at the polls. There had to be a response to that. And the response was what has always worked. The oldest wedge issue in America, going back to Bacon's Rebellion, is race. So you see this stoking of this anti-critical race theory propaganda campaign. You can literally trace the mentions on Fox News, and they come right around the election, and they just spike and keep going up and up. So I say all that to say, if people were not engaging with the 1619 Project, if people were not engaging with other works that were really trying to show the legacy of slavery, the way structural inequality works, then you wouldn't see this backlash, right? Like powerful people would not care about this project if only Black people were reading it, for instance. They wouldn't care. I mean, many Black people been knowing this stuff, right? Like, I had to get in vernacular on that one now. Like, they might have, said what I've heard a lot from Black folks is like, I didn't have the history and like the data, but none of this is like shocking, right? Like we've been knowing this, but it's understanding that there was a response, there was a willingness to grapple. I mean, I hear, it's been almost 3 years now. I've been on the road and then on the Zoom road talking about this project. And what I hear from so many Americans, particularly not Black Americans, is I just didn't know. I had no idea. And they're angry the same way I was angry at 15 when I realized there was this whole history beyond the lens and people know it's there and chose not to teach it to us.
That's right.
And that is the response. And so people who are very afraid of, the idea, I mean, there's a reason Black people were not allowed to read and write during slavery, because we know that learning knowledge leads to liberation, that you don't accept certain things when you know better. People in power know that. And there's nothing that elite people fear more than understanding amongst the people who can actually vote with their feet and oust that power. The last thing I'll say on that, what we learned during the pandemic was we can do whatever we want, right? All the things we're told we can't do in this country. Can't have universal health care, too expensive. Can't have a income guarantee because it's too expensive. You can't help people pay their rent because it's too expensive and it'll make them lazy. All of these things. We printed money overnight. We came up with trillions of dollars overnight when we felt that we had to do that. And so there was a certain wool that was removed from all of our collective eyes, that everything we said we couldn't do for our society, we could. And so now we had to have a response. So if we can get people worried that, oh, they're tearing down your monuments. Oh, they want to make you think that you don't have a great history anymore. Oh, they want little Johnny to feel guilty in the classroom. Then you can distract from the real work that could be done. And this is where people who only think about class, what they don't understand is that whiteness has its own value. And whenever people say, why do these white people keep voting against their own class interest? Whiteness is the interest. It is the interest. I mean, now I'm about to take y'all all the way to church. I'm sorry. But I think about this a lot. Like we are exceptional in all the wrong ways. We believe in exceptionalism. We are the most unequal of the Western democracies, right? We have the greatest wealth and the greatest poverty at the same time. How do we allow that? We're the only country where you have a baby and 6 weeks later, you have to go back to work. We're the only country that doesn't help provide childcare, right? Like all of these things, we die earlier than other countries that are wealthy like we are. We are the most carceral nation in the world, period. So when we think about all of those things, there's a reason people don't want us to have that understanding. Because if you had that understanding, you would make different choices. And I don't think most Americans want us to be this way. They don't know better. And so when Americans start getting knowledge, that knowledge has to be suppressed. And so it's not incidental that the same states that are passing anti-history laws are passing anti-voter laws. They're passing laws to target marginalized or disfavored groups because that is a way to distract. So you target the LGBT community, right? You make this about these culture wars. You target women's reproductive rights. All of these things, if you read books on fascism, it's the playbook. It really is the playbook. So I'm both optimistic and not. Because I'm not optimistic. Let me rephrase that. I think we are at a place of choosing. And I know people love this idea. The second to the last essay in the book is by Ibram X. Kendi. It's called Progress. And it talks about Americans' obsession with progress. Because we can look to the past and say, things were really bad back then, but look, we made progress. It's not like that anymore. Thank you, I'm not in slavery. Thank you. And then we look to the future And we say things might be, they're not where we want them to be right now, but they're going to get better in the future because progress is inevitable. But progress is not inevitable, right? We either make it so or we don't. And this belief that things will naturally get better means we don't have to do anything right now. So when Dr. King said the arc of the universe is, right,
Bends
long, but bends towards justice. I got to respect Dr. King, but no. Well, I think the arc of the universe is probably a circle that will keep turning back on itself unless we bend it. We have to bend it, right? So we're at a point where we either accept that the suppression of democracy will continue, that we will allow states to implement minority rule, that we will allow ourselves to go backwards, that we will allow the taking of basic citizenship rights from our most marginalized in our community, or we will decide that we are going to build the America of the majority and the America of our highest ideals. But we have to choose that, and there are no safe states. I live in New York. I think sometimes we're like, well, our state legislature will never do those things. You don't think what Texas does affects what happens to all of us? So we have to decide. And I don't know how to feel, because right now, as Dr. King also said, those who wish us ill use time more efficiently than those who wish us well. And those of us who actually believe in helping our fellow citizens, who believe in ensuring that everyone in this country has equal opportunity, who believe in the idea of democracy, we're not organized and we're not using time efficiently. And we're going to look up and we're going to be back into another nadir. And that's what I worry about.
I want to come back to something you said, because it's something I hear a lot, which is, I didn't learn this in school. I didn't learn this in school. Sometimes it's a confrontation, right? Like, this must not be correct because I didn't learn in school.
Absolutely.
But often it's a lament. And a couple of years ago, I spent the year at just up the street at the Baltimore School for the Arts, where the sophomore class puts on a production, and they had read Birthright Citizens. They had read the material that's in here on citizenship. And we were in rehearsals, and one of the young men who was playing George Hackett, who makes a brief appearance in here, finished his lines, and then he turned to us and said, why have you kept this history from us for so long? And I was reminded, I don't know if you've ever seen, there was an episode of Skip Gates's Finding Your Roots that featured Chris Rock, a comedian. Folks know Chris Rock. And Gates did his thing. He did the research, and then he opens the book and he says, now here is your family. And Rock had explained that his dad had been a janitor in Brooklyn, New York, and comedy was the only thing that had kept him from following in his father's footsteps. And then Gates tells him that his great-grandfather had been an activist in Reconstruction. And you can see everything change, right? You can see everything change. And what he says is, if I'd only known that, right? And so I wonder about imagination and how you think about imagination in this work, because I think part of what you're doing is, yes, telling us about the past, but maybe you're also trying to help us see a different kind of future.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons I became a historian or a journalist, not a historian.
Oh, I love that. That was a good select.
Right? I mean, history was my first love, but I understood that as a journalist, you can study history and write about history, but you can write about the way that history is shaping the right now. And when you see that, if you understand what has constructed a system, then you also have the code to deconstruct it. And that is how you build a different future. You have to understand the past in order to build a different future. And there's a reason, I talk about in the preface about how we come to understand the history that we know. And it's not just, some of it you get in your textbooks, but most of it you don't. Most of it you get from watching movies. Most of it you get from, political speeches, or when you go to a park and who are all the monuments to. Exercise I like to do in Brooklyn, though I probably could do it here. If you've ever been to the Brooklyn Museum, and at the very top of the Brooklyn Museum are the lists of all these great philosophers. And it sends the message that all of our history sends to us all the time. Because every philosopher up there is someone we would consider white, except Confucius, and that's it. So if you study that, what that tells you is there's no great African philosophers, clearly. There's no great philosophers who came from anywhere outside of Europe except this one man who came from China, and that's it. And you're not thinking about that someone shaped that. You're thinking about, just as I did as a child, if it was important, if people had done these things, surely we would know about it. And then you realize, oh no, this has been manipulated. This has been managed. This is all part of something that is intentional. And then if you're like me, you become, who's already very nerdy, you just become more nerdy and obsessed with learning this history. But I think understanding how history is made, how our understanding of our society is shaped, is very empowering. It's also very frightening to people who benefit from that particular shaping. So this project is absolutely about imagination. It's about how Black people can imagine and conceive of ourselves. How differently do you think about this history? The 4th of July, for instance, which first you grow up thinking this is a great holiday. Then as a Black child, you start to question, well, damn, my people weren't actually free. So what does that mean for me? And then if you're like me, then you reject the holiday altogether. But if you can have this understanding of the way that we were moving and shaping and fomenting rebellion, being savvy and playing sides against each other, and how we were the architects of ideas of freedom, then you can think about that history and imagine yourself, because that's all that we want as humans, to see ourselves in the story. And so it is about imagining who we are as a people, and then who we can be as a country. As you know very well, because you do a lot of work in the period of Reconstruction, they had to tell us Reconstruction failed. Because if we briefly engage in multiracial democracy, if we briefly try to redeem the grave sin of slavery, and then choose to go into the 100-year period of racial apartheid, then you realize none of this was inevitable, that we could have been a different country. And that helps the imagination. So we look backwards, to me, in order to understand where we are right now, to then build and conceive of where we can be and what we can become. And that is why so much of this project, I mean, my bad faith conservative critics, when I said that the project is a work of memory, were like, oh, so it's not history. No. History is about memory. And this is a work of memory. I mean, how many of y'all were taught that George Washington's teeth were made of wood? Raise your hand if you were taught that, right?
Wow. That's a lot of hands.
It's a lot of hands. And I remember I read Henry Weincheck's book, Imperfect God, is the first place at the age of maybe 32 years old that I ever read that his teeth were made of human teeth, pulled from the mouths of enslaved people. And it was one of those moments, and I'm like, how do we all come to know the same collective lie? And who is that lie in service of? And once you have enough of those moments, you begin to be skeptical of everything that you're hearing. It's like the red pill in the Matrix, right? Like all of a sudden, and why is the red pill in the Matrix dangerous? I mean, y'all are older, y'all see the Matrix. When I talk to college students, sometimes they have no idea what I'm talking about. But the red pill in the Matrix is dangerous because once you realize something is amiss here, there's something happening behind this veneer. And once you question that, then you become dangerous to the people who are controlling the society. And that is why I talk to Jason Stanley a lot. He's a Yale philosopher. He writes about fascism, propaganda. And he says, Nicole, I knew you and this work was going to be attacked because this work is going against the mythic past. And in a country that believes it's based on an idea, then if somebody bursts that idea, they don't believe that the nation can stand. But we know better because we built the country. We know it's strong.
You know, my answer to that young man was, I didn't learn this in school either.
Most of us
Right?
don't. Yeah.
And I remember Toni Morrison, right, who said, you know, I'm paraphrasing, right? We have to write the books, right, that we want to read, that we need to read. And for me, this project is very much that. I want to ask you about educators, about teachers, because I think you're someone who is better positioned than many of us to be insightful about the vice grip that educators in this country, particularly public school teachers, are being set in. And I wanted to invite you to talk about, yes, education runs through this book. In nearly every essay, we encounter an educator or a scene, whether it's the deprivation, right, of learning, of the ability to read and write, whether it's Brown versus Board of Education and that transformation, or it's the building of prisons instead of schools.
Yes.
But what I want to ask you is to talk to us about what it has been like to watch state legislatures weaponize this book and turn it against educators, right? The very folks, I think, whom you have been a companion to and a champion for a very long time. That seems to be a particularly cruel cut.
It is. It's been extremely disheartening and distressing in many ways. One, these were educators who were coming out of a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, though we act like we're not, but you know what I'm saying. The worst part of the pandemic, who, I mean, overnight had to figure out how to engage students and teach students online, who were dealing with all of the same mental health issues, childcare issues, everything that we were going through. And that for this brief period, we were acting like they were valiant, right? Just like we did with all of our essential workers, all the people that every day we don't care that they're struggling. All of a sudden, because they made the rest of our lives more comfortable in the pandemic, we were giving them the respect and dignity that they should have always had. And then everything just like that, we flipped the switch on them. And then they became these people who we can't trust, who are indoctrinating our children, who we needed to watch over every second of the day. And to be clear, most of my career, I was an education reporter. I'm extremely skeptical of public education and its failings of Black children. I have seen the best of teaching and I have seen the absolute worst of teaching. I've seen it all. We are in Baltimore City. Everything is represented there, right? We know that. But as a profession, this wasn't about trying to correct any inequality in the schools. This wasn't about trying to support teachers, become better educators. This was about simply a political tactic, and they didn't care. They don't care how they are hurting educators who don't deserve it, but also it's part of a larger plan to try to privatize education. We should just be clear on that, right? This goes in hand with a larger privatization agenda. So that has been really troubling because the truth is educators already struggle to teach this. We know from surveys, we know from every time we see an example of someone holding a mock slave auction, which we just saw another one 2 days ago. I always said that I would have been so impressed if educators were teaching critical race theory. Like all the time when, progressives were thinking the best tactic would be like, no one's teaching that. No one's teaching that. No, actually, they should be teaching that. Right? Like if educators were actually teaching high level understanding and analyses of structural inequality, that would be amazing. They're not. And instead, all we've done is just made their jobs and their lives even harder, all for what is propaganda, for parents who, I have an 11-year-old. If I want to know what my daughter's teachers are teaching them, I ask them, which is what normal people do. You don't pass laws, you don't ban books, you don't ban ideas. And I think what has been the hardest for educators has been how few folks have stood up for them, how organized the opposition has been, and how unorganized and really missing the support has been. Because I don't think, again, the polling is clear. Most Americans oppose these bans. Most Americans want kids to learn about racism and racial inequality, but those Americans weren't showing up at school board meetings. I think my profession failed because I think my profession gave much more outsized attention to those parents than who are the majority of parents. But we didn't step up for our teachers, and we didn't step up for our schools, and we didn't step up for our children to have the right to learn this history. I think that's starting to change. It took a while. I think people were dismissive of these laws. Maybe they didn't realize what Republicans have become, though I don't understand how that's possible. And didn't really believe that these laws would get passed. But I will say we are now seeing people who are trying to fight back on behalf of learning, on behalf of teaching. Indiana just, parents and educators organized there. They turned back. They're one of the first red states where they actually were able to turn back the anti-CRT legislation. They're fighting real hard in South Carolina right now to turn it back. But again, like, the enemy, right, of progress are good people who do nothing, who sit at home and read something and shake their head, but ultimately don't act on it. If there were all of these people going down to these school board meetings and saying, absolutely not, you don't have the right to say what my child cannot learn, these laws wouldn't be passing. And our teachers, many of them are leaving the profession. I mean, they've been through hell in the pandemic, and now they're going through this to not get paid very well, to not get treated very well. There's a lot of other things you could do. And yet we want to say, and I say this all the time, we tell our children nothing is more important than their education. And then we show them the exact opposite of that every single day.
And yet somehow you found yourself in the classroom out of all of this.
Somehow.
I'm now able to move to some questions from the audience, and they want to ask, folks want to hear more about your center at Howard. Want to know specifically about, I think, how you think HBCUs fit not only into this story, right, but into that future vision, right, that you're sort of calling into being in this work.
So, I mean, part of me being at Howard is just living, out. One of my lifelong regrets is that I didn't go to Howard. So, I mean, like a debilitating regret. Like Ta-Nehisi would be like, let's go to homecoming. And I'm like, I wouldn't survive because I'll be so depressed the whole time because it's not really mine. But now it is. But, I've thought, I've spent most of my career writing about school integration. And much the way my views on democracy changed, I'm conflicted. I'm conflicted about patriotism. I'm conflicted about school integration now in the same way. I do think that public schools particularly are our greatest democratizing institution that we have left. They're one of the few things that most Americans still engage, few institutions most Americans still engage with. 90% of American school children still attend a public school. I believe in the idea of a common good, all of those things. But I also realize everyone doesn't believe in that. And the harms to our communities when we were constantly trying to chase people who didn't want to be in school with our children. And this idea as Black people that we get that success is leaving Black people, Black communities, Black institutions behind, that this is how we are to measure our success, that you have not truly shown your achievement if you are doing this within Black institutions. And I say that as someone who, since the second grade, was in white institutions. So what happened to me at the University of North Carolina, I knew immediately if I didn't go there, I was going to a HBCU, period. That some people believe the way that I would get my revenge on them would be to go to an even more elite white institution. But I had no desire to do that anymore because, as we all know, I remember even as a kid when people in the community saw a spark in me, or they were like, "Oh, she has potential." The first thing they tell you is, "You got to get out of here. You got to get out of here. Go to school. Get what you got to. You got to get out of here." And it is ingrained in us that success means we have to leave our communities behind. And I've just decided that I don't believe in that. And the shameful thing to me is there are a bunch of Black folks who didn't have to spend 30 years before they figured that out. You know, when I go to Howard, there are Black folks who only ever wanted to work at a Black institution. I'm here being like, oh, damn, that was where it was at. And I thought a lot about what message would it send to someone like myself, rejects that publicly and says, this is actually where I want to be, where we should be, where we should put our resources, that these are the institutions that we should build up, having gotten that credibility that you need, right? Having shown that you can achieve within their realm, but that we don't have to. And so what was important when I went to Howard was that I didn't just secure opportunity for myself. I've really tried to live my adult life where if I ever got any bit of power, that power was always to be shared with community. So that's why I decided to found the Center for Journalism and Democracy. I raised, at this point, almost $25 million. And to be clear, I am petty, but in ways that benefit society. So I'm an Aries, I can't help it. So when I found out that rich donor at Carolina had interfered with my hiring process and that people felt he had the right to do that because he had pledged 25 million. He only gave maybe 2, but he pledged 25 million, that I was going to actually raise that same amount of money. And it wasn't going to be a pledge. It wasn't going to be a pledge. It was going to be real money, and I was going to bring it with me because if you think that 25 million was the largest donation ever made to the North Carolina School of Journalism. University of North Carolina is the oldest public university in America. It was founded in the late 1700s. And that they were allowing this man in a very wealthy school, $25 million. So what could $25 million do for a historically Black college? And so the center is really about what I think is most important, which is democracy and the role that Black journalists and Black people have always played in building democracy. And so I am using that money to found the center that will not just serve Howard, but a constellation of historically Black colleges to teach historically informed investigative reporting in service of democracy, and to give students what I wish I had had when I was trying to make it, but also to build on the long legacy of the Black press as the truth tellers in our society. And that's what we're going to do.
I'm going to take you back a bit.
Okay.
Not too
To
far.
1619? Oh, no. Okay. Not that far.
Now, January of 2020, the first time you and I met, I was going to give a paper at the American Historical Association, and on my panel was a historian who had been among your early and most pointed critics.
His name rhymes with Ron Willentz, but we won't say.
It does. Like poetry, not.
Told
And
me.
I texted you or something.
Yeah.
I found you
emailed
somewhere.
me.
I did. I emailed you.
I still have the email.
And I said, I'm going to try and, I don't know, take him down a notch. And I just wanted to share with you what I'm up to. And I still remember being in that ballroom in some hotel in New York, and seeing you come in the back of the room You know, you can't miss her, right? When she comes in the back of the room. And I thought to myself, okay, now it is really on. But my question is really what it has been like to have folks come, if you will, not for the message, but for the messenger. Because that's what I wanted to put on the table that afternoon, is that you are not the first, right? Hardly the first. My paper was about W.E.B. Du Bois and how folks came for Du Bois.
Over Black Reconstruction.
Over Black Reconstruction, his monumental, still read, recently republished by the American Library, Black Reconstruction. But that the critique of Du Bois had been that he was about ideology, not history, that he was all in his feelings, right, and not in his thought, that he had deployed subpar methods, right, to write this magnificent work. So can you talk a little bit about this? Right? It wasn't about the message. It was about the messenger for Du Bois in those years. And I think in some sense, the 1619 Project has also faced exactly that.
So Martha will never give herself enough credit. So let me just say, that's when I knew you were going to be my ride or die. And I'm feeling a little emotional. I mean that because this was a really dark time. And a lot of historians were messaging me privately and saying, oh, we have your back. Oh, those historians are so wrong. Oh, this, brash as I may be on Twitter, I am a human being. I care deeply about this work. I know the hours and the research and the care I took because I know people were going to try to attack a narrative that centered Black people in the American story. I knew all of that. And no one was really willing to like publicly take a stand. And Martha emails me and she's like, I'm going to present. And she didn't say I'm going to take him down because she, very reserved historian. But I know enough about how historians talk. I was like, oh, she's about to take his ass down. And I'm going to be there. So she emails me and she's like, I'm going to present this paper on a panel with Sean Wilentz. I'm going to present this paper. You sent me the paper and you sent me some of the original writings that were published against Du Bois. And really, it was the same language almost, word for word, that Sean Wilentz and others were using against the project. And I remember I emailed you back and I was just like, thank you. I was so grateful. And I even hate that I felt like so vulnerable to just be so grateful because it's just not with my airy spirit, but I was. And then I was like, I want to see this because one, I was like, I just want to see him get taken down by someone he can't credential, right? He couldn't disrespect you. He could disrespect you, but not in the same way. And it was so powerful because you think of how we think about Du Bois now, and they were going against him, but they were also going against his argument because they had been the gatekeepers of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction, I mean, it is eerily similar to what happened with the 1619 because their argument was Reconstruction was a failure, that Black people weren't ready to rule, like all of those lost cause narrative. And here comes this Black man who's saying, no, you got it all wrong. They talked about his research methods, all of those types of things. They tried to credential him. And so it was this amazing and powerful moment. Unfortunately, historians are very long-winded and they read their papers and then I didn't get to actually see them debate, which is what I really wanted, was to see them debate.
Me too.
But I'm just to this day so grateful. And there were many dark moments where you would send me a message, but also publicly on Twitter and on social, be supporting the project at a time when people are like, all historians have said the project is not legitimate. They've debunked it. And people just weren't speaking up. So I guess that's a way of saying it has not always been easy. Many times it has not. And I had to constantly remind myself, like, when there were sold out venues and the lines were long and people were loving it, I was the face of the project and I was happy to be the face. So when everyone was trying to tear it down, I'm still the face of the project, and now I can't run away from it and be like, oh, it's a collective work. This is everyone, right? I had to take it and I had to defend it. And I had to defend it because not only was I defending myself as a journalist, all you have as a journalist is if you don't have credibility, if people don't believe you, you have nothing. But also it was like defending our history. It was defending our people. It was defending our right to be the authors of our story, and not have to have a PhD to tell those stories, even though it's based all on the work of historians. So the beauty of it, though, and I will say, I've said this many times, I am built for this, right? Like my grandmother, y'all can clap for that because I really, I am. In the darkest moments, I thought so much about, like, my grandmother was born on a cotton plantation where our people had been enslaved. And she had a 4th grade education. She migrated north with my father, and they had him and his older brother. They had a bag of cold fried chicken that her grandmother had fried for her because it travels well. She had a suitcase, and she had her determination that her children would not pick cotton in Mississippi. Her life didn't turn out like she hoped it would be. She had to be a domestic. She was a janitor. She was not able to live her dreams, but she planted the seeds for me to exist and to create this thing. And she, even though she had a 4th grade education, she taught herself to read well enough that she could read her newspaper every day. And I think about, like, she died when I was in college. She never even knew the possibility of what my life would become. But that's what I come from. And so all of these people who want to tear this down, you're not built on what we're built on. You're just not. I'm like, the words that you can write, the harshest words you can write, are nothing like what our people have gone through. And so I'm good. And the greatest thing about having, anybody who's a writer in here or historian or anyone who does public work, I would love for you to have your work undergo the type of scrutiny that the 1619 Project has gone through and see will you come away unscathed. It's impossible. But I've never, and I know the writers in here, when you publish, right, there's this moment after you publish. For me, it's about 2 weeks where I'm always waiting, like, for someone to find a mistake that I've made an error that. And for 2 weeks, you don't want to check your email because you're like, your voicemail. And then after 2 weeks, you're like, okay, I've made it through. I'm probably okay. I've never published with so much confidence in my life as when the 1619 Project, the book, published, because I'm like, anything you could say, you have said in the last 2.5 years. Any flaw, anything that you could argue. And all it did was provide me all of the critique, both the good, because there was good critique, of course. You can't produce anything that's perfect. I've never read anything I've written and felt, this is perfection. I could never do any improvement. That's never happened. But what it did was gave me a roadmap on what to study, how to sharpen my arguments. There are 1,000 endnotes in this book, right? And so now I'm like, you don't agree with this? Argue with the historians, because this is what it was based on. And the most contested part of the project, which is 3 paragraphs in an essay that was almost 10,000 words in a project that originally published at 40,000 words, is about slavery and the revolution. Now, I should have been more specific with my language, absolutely. But it is an amazing thing that anyone could be shocked that in a country where the first colony was Virginia, the oldest, the largest, the wealthiest, most of the population was enslaved. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence was a Virginian enslaver. The father of the Constitution was a Virginian enslaver. Bill of Rights, Virginia enslaver. First president, Virginia enslaver. Most of the first presidents, Virginia enslavers. And somehow it is shocking that slavery had something to do with any of that. I'm just like, but then you realize how important that our mythology is to us, and that someone, because again, this is contested in the field for sure. I mean, people come after Woody Holton. They don't seem to come after Alan Taylor as much, but I'm basing it on the work of historians. Like I didn't sit down one day and say, let me make up some shit about the revolution and publish it in the New York Times. Like that's not, of course not. But the difference was, it was coming out of the academy and now shaping our collective understanding. And it was okay in the academy. And it wasn't, Black woman with, what'd you say, flame or kinky red hair that looks like this, making these arguments. And that had to be discredited, or at least attempts. But the beauty of it is it clearly hasn't worked for most people. Thank y'all.